How might a Christian professor respond to some popular TikTok videos? Check it out. We're gonna start with the first one of two people you'll definitely recognize.
So how did you resolve the urges of a believer to reject evidence in favor of faith?
What are you talking about? The urges of a believer? The urges of a believer to reject evidence? Who says? That's spoken by somebody who's not a believer. Because there's no urge to reject evidence. I don't think that my faith is related to evidence. They're different things.
Okay.
My faith approach is a mystery. My faith comes from a place of a need to be grateful.
I love that they're having this conversation, and I appreciate that Neil deGrasse Tyson is willing to ask this question, and I mourn that he's had believers in his life resist the urge to give evidence. I appreciate Colbert's willingness to have this conversation, step up and share his faith, but the idea that faith is opposed to or without evidence is frankly not biblical. Moses did miracles and gave evidence so that people would have confidence that he spoke for God. Jesus did miracles to give us confirmation of his identity. Love the conversation, but I think there's confusion among both about the relationship between faith and evidence. Let's check out the next one.
Justification for grape? Where's that in the Bible? Well, Mark Johnson, I'm glad you asked. And since so many Christians refuse to read their own Bible, let me do it for you. Ready? The book of the law, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 28 through 29 says, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and he rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Wow, that's just wonderful. So if a man rapes a virgin, then he gets to keep her forever.
In some ways, he's right, that there's a lot of Christians who do not read their Bibles. There's also a lot of non-Christians who pick certain passages out of their context and critique them without awareness of what's going on, and that's exactly what he is doing. A few things might help. Number one, the English translation often says rape, but if you go back to the original Hebrew, it's probably better translated as seduction. So when you look at another passage in 2 Samuel, where the son of David, Amnon, rapes Tamar, that is a violent kind of rape. In this case, it's probably really a form of seduction. Second, when you compare this law to other laws in the ancient Near East at this time, it's far more humane. There's a Mesopotamian law that says if a woman is raped, she is forced, regardless of the kind of rape, forced to marry her rapist, and then the wife of the rapist is to be raped and then sold into kind of a slavery concubinage. Now, when it comes to this law, part of it is actually to protect the woman. In other words, if a man seduces her, he is to commit to her and care for her for life and cannot just discard her like we see many times today. I understand there's other questions within this passage, but if we just take a look back and see how God has taken his people ultimately towards the sexual ethic of Jesus, I think we can have a much better context to jarring passages like this.
Jesus died for my sins, then I can do whatever, right? Because salvation is free, right?
Right.
And they're like, yeah! And I'm like, oh, I guess if Hitler and all of them are going to heaven then, right? No, don't say that! Well, he believed in Jesus, right? I mean, so why didn't Jesus die for his sins, you know? And then they would just be like, get out.
Now this Muslim, that salvation is by grace through faith, and it's not a matter of works. He gets that. But the idea that Hitler believed in Jesus is frankly ridiculous. There's not a shred of evidence that this is the case. Now, within Christianity is the idea that God would have forgiven Hitler. Yeah, this is true, because Jesus paid the debt for all of us on the cross. If he repented and truly understood the level of his sin, God would have forgiven him. Let's check out the next one.
The Bible doesn't need to use the English word homosexual.
Good, because it doesn't. The word homosexual does not appear in the original manuscript of the Bible once. Not in Greek, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. In fact, there is only one word in the Bible that has been mistranslated in English into homosexual, and that word is arsenokoitai. And that word is only used twice by the Apostle Paul and the word itself was invented by the Apostle Paul. It did not exist in the Greek language before Paul used it, and it's only used scarcely after. It would be ridiculous to say that Paul invented this word to condemn homosexuality, because in Greek there were over a dozen other words that referred to homosexual sex and relationships that Paul could have used that his audience would have easily understood. Instead, he needed to create a word for something that the language didn't have a word to describe. And the best understanding of arsenokoitai is a reference to exploitative and idolatrous same-sex sex that was common in the Greco-Roman world. It doesn't mean homosexual.
Brandon, thank you for responding to my interview with Preston. I think we agree that the English translation homosexual or homosexuality that appears at times is not the best translation of the original Greek. Because sometimes homosexual and homosexuality can refer to identity, or it can refer to a certain same-sex attraction. The question is, where did Paul get this term? And you're right, it only shows up in 1 Corinthians 6 and in 1 Timothy. Well, you seem to imply that the best explanation is that he got it somehow from the Greco-Roman culture. But who is Paul writing to? In both cases, he's writing to Christians. What was the primary source of authority that they had? The Bible, and in particular, the Old Testament. If we go back to the Old Testament in Leviticus chapter 18, which is translated that a man should not sleep with another man, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, we see a longer phrase that contains within it arsenokoitai, like you refer to. Now, what does arsen actually mean? It means male, irrespective of age. Koite refers to bed. So technically, it's males who bed other males. That's the clear, direct translation from the source that Paul would have used. And the best translation, I think, is found in the NIV, where it talks about men having sex with other men. All right, let's keep going.
Hey atheists, what's your best evidence that Christianity is false?
You can create the universe. You can create the earth. You can cause a flood to kill humans. You can have plagues to kill humans. Somehow, you can't write a book on your own.
Hey, I love that this Christian is asking questions and willing to listen to atheists, their arguments against Christianity. This is the kind of conversation we should have. Now, the idea of her response that God can create the world and he can do a flood, but he can't write a book himself, is kind of crazy. It's not that God can't do this. Obviously he can. It's that God chooses to speak in a range of different ways, through dreams, through nature, sometimes through visions, and sometimes in particular through a book. So rather than looking at this and saying, this is crazy, God can't do this, I'd invite you to change your reference and think, if there is a God and he wants to communicate with us, why did he maybe choose to communicate through a book? And I think that might open up some very different understandings of the God that stands behind the scriptures. Here's another one.
I'm an atheist because there's no way I can look back 2,000 years and read a book and go, oh, well, that's the way I should live.
I actually get that. If you're an atheist and you look like, here's a book written 2,000 years ago, what does that have to do with my life today? I get it. But I'd actually invite you to ask, what is it about this book that has changed more governments, that has changed more lives, shaped music, art, language, shaped the world positively more than any book that has ever been written? It's not just some book written 2,000 years ago. It is the definitive book for Western and Eastern culture. Why has it been so significant? I'd also push back and invite you to think, why not trust a book written 2,000 years ago? This is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, that we think the latest things are the best. Maybe there's some ancient wisdom written a long time ago that they understood about human life and purpose and knowing God that we've lost today. I'd invite you to maybe rethink that approach to the scriptures. Here's another one.
I ain't reading all that.
Handing someone a book is not proof that God exists, okay? Hey, do you believe in Edward Cullen? Do I believe in Edward Cullen? No. What? But how could you not? We have the proof. Here are all the books.
I actually have total sympathy for this non-Christian. I don't think it's a great piece of evidence to say God exists or Christianity is true, here's a book. To me, I'm not gonna point towards that. I'm gonna point towards the beginning of the universe, pointing towards a source outside of itself, a beginner. I'm gonna point towards the fine-tuning of the universe, pointing towards a fine-tuner. Beauty in the world, pointing towards a divine artist. The information in the cell and the origin of life, pointing towards an information giver. The objective moral law we all know, pointing towards a moral law giver. And the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the Bible is a piece of evidence, but if we just give the Bible, that's going to be no more compelling for someone who doesn't believe the Bible is true than a Muslim giving me a copy of the Quran. So if you're going to give someone the Bible, you're going to have to talk about how we know it's archaeologically supported, manuscript tradition, fulfilled prophecies, internal testimony, and the lives that have been changed through it. Hey, leave a comment below if there's some responses you thought, you know what, I could have answered better if I missed something. If you have any TikTok videos in the future you want me to respond to, please put them below and let us know if this is valuable and you want some more of this on the channel. Thanks for watching.